Section 7 of National Geographic Magazine, Volume 1, Number 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Survey of the Coast by Herbert G. Ogden, Part 1. At the inception of the Coast and Geodetic Survey in the early years of the century, so little was known of the dangers attending navigation along our extensive seaboard, that those who engaged in commercial enterprises were constrained to rely upon local knowledge and the reports of the hardy navigators who might carry their ventures to success. The charts available were by no means a sure reliance, and it has since been shown contained many serious errors. The great headlands and outlying shoals that present the greatest obstacles to the safety of coastwise navigation had not been carefully surveyed, and their relative positions to one another were only approximately determined. The capacities of the harbors had not been ascertained, many were unknown, and even at the great port of New York, the Gedney or main channel was not developed until after the permanent establishment of the survey in 1832, and the thorough exploration of the entrance was undertaken. A list of the sunken dangers and new channels that have been discovered during the progress of the work would fill pages. It is true such developments were to be expected in making a precise survey of the comparatively uncharted coast, but they, nevertheless, clearly point to the necessity of the work. We may also assume that the men who were controlling the destinies of the Republic realized that a knowledge of the coast was essential if they would succeed in building up a commerce, without which it was believed the prosperity of the people could not be assured. The deep draught vessels of the present day could not have traded along our shores on any margin of safety with the little that was known, and it is largely due to the perfect charting of the coast that commercial enterprise has found it practicable to build the larger vessels of modern type to meet the increasing demands of trade. The survey proposed was also required in providing for the public defense, as it is a self-evident proposition that if we would protect a harbor from a hostile fleet, we must know not only the channels by which the fleet might enter, but their relations to each other and the points of vantage that should be utilized in obstructing them. And in modern warfare, to know these things only approximately will not suffice, for precision is practiced now in the art of war, as well as in the arts of peace. The lack of charts of our extensive coastline, or indeed of any practical information that could be utilized in a systematic defense against foreign aggression, was only one of the many perplexities that surrounded our forefathers in building the nation. By their valor they had wrested a jewel from the British crown, and had inaugurated a system of government by the people, which on their sacred honors they had sworn to defend. But not a generation had passed away when they saw new dangers, and were forced to contemplate again taking up arms in defense of their rights. The land was theirs. Even far towards the setting sun pioneers had explored it, and they knew whence might come a hostile foe. But of the waters from far away to the eastward, that flowed on until they washed every shore and filled the great bays, even to the heart of the Republic, they knew little, save that over that almost immeasurable expanse might come the fleet of destroyers to penetrate they knew not where, and inflict incalculable damage, months ere the dreary tales might be told. It must be remembered there were no telegraphs, no railroads, no steamboats in those days, and time taken by the forelock was time gained. The speed of man could not be overtaken as we see it today in the wondrous inventions of the last generations. Each community was dependent upon itself alone in time of danger to ward off the blow or yield to a more powerful foe. Assistance could hardly be obtained in months, and perhaps not then. It was not possible for any man to study or to learn the points of danger and prepare a system of defense. President Jefferson, in his far-seeing statesmanship, threatened with war, realized the danger. A survey of the coast he believed essential to the national defense, and to the prosperity of the nation in time of peace. Had his wise counsels prevailed, and the survey been prosecuted with vigor, instead of being almost immediately suspended for a quarter of a century, there can be no question but that it would have saved the people millions of dollars in expenditures and put other untold millions into their coffers, through the impetus it would have given to commerce years before commerce actually had a name in many that are now thriving seaport towns. But it is not to be supposed the commercial importance of a knowledge of the coast and harbors was underrated because the survey was not prosecuted. The people were poor, the task would be expensive and laborious. The appliances for the work were not in the possession of the government, and above all, war came sooner than was anticipated, and the energies of the people were taxed to the utmost in combat with their powerful foe. And when peace came again, there was the inevitable commercial depression that follows a resort to arms. The men of the day fully realized how illy they were prepared to invite commerce to our shores, or incite our own people to more extensive trade. There was nothing to adequately represent those magnificent harbors that have since become famous the world over, nor of that long line of coast with its treacherous shoals, whereby those seeking new ventures might judge of the dangers to be encountered. The absolute ignorance that existed was aptly described in the Albany Argus in 1832, when the propriety of reviving the Act of 1807 was under discussion, as follows, quote, "It had been discovered by an American statesman that parent countries always keep the commercial knowledge of their colonies as a leading string in their own hands, and that as practical navigators, American seamen knew less of their own shores than the country and its allies from whose subjection we had recently delivered ourselves by force of arms. In large vessels, 3 nations, the Dutch, the French, and the English, approached our harbors with less risk than those bearing our own flag, at the same time that in small and more manageable vessels we had long been known as a match for the strongest. The President, Jefferson, saw the defect and the manner in which it must be remedied. We were at that time on the brink of war, about whose justice some of our politicians differed in opinion, and it was, of course, more necessary to pray for a fortunate result than to preach the causes which had occasioned the quarrel. To have procured for the nation, even had it been practicable so to do, the old charts from the Dutch, French, and English governments, would have only been to put our knowledge on a par with theirs, while to execute more recent and accurate surveys was advancing the new country above the old. With the clear and bold perception which always distinguishes men of genius when they are entrusted in times of danger with the destinies of a nation, the President recommended a survey of the whole coast with all the aid of the more recent discoveries of science." End quote. The proposed survey was strongly advocated by President Jefferson and the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Gallatin, and in February 1807 Congress passed the first act providing for the work. 13 separate plans, or schemes, were submitted for consideration. Among the number was one by Professor F.R. Hassler, which was finally adopted, and Professor Hassler was appointed the first superintendent. It is not necessary to dwell in detail upon the varying fortunes of the survey during the 3/4 of a century that have passed since the original act authorizing it. The first 30 years of experiment, before it was finally established as a bureau of the Treasury Department, show only too clearly the ignorance and prejudice against which the supporters, we may say founders, of the survey had to contend. But they had only the experience of all men who attempt the inauguration of new things, of which it cannot be shown that they will return a cash profit at the end of 6 months. To the opponents of the measure, cash could not be seen at all, and the profit, whatever it should be, was only an intangible kind of benefit, to be realized in the future by additional security to their property and commerce, but in reality, as has since been appreciated, the direct saving of many millions of dollars annually. The War of 1812 interrupted Professor Hassler's labors, and it was not until 1817 that he actually commenced work, but he was stopped the next year by a limitation of the law requiring the work to be performed by the military departments. In 1832, Congress passed a special act reviving the law of 1807, and Professor Hassler was again appointed superintendent. A further interruption occurred in 1834 by the transfer of the Bureau to the Navy Department, but this was of short duration, as it was retransferred to the Treasury Department in 1836, where it has since remained. Professor Hassler continued as superintendent until his death in November 1843. He was succeeded by Professor A.D. Bosch, who was fortunate in assuming the charge under much more favorable auspices than had prevailed under his predecessor. By the appropriation bill passed in March 1843, the President was directed to appoint a commission to reorganize the Bureau and prescribe methods for its future conduct. The plan recommended by the commission was substantially that which had been followed by Professor Hassler. It was approved by the President a few months before Professor Bosch assumed the superintendency, and has since been the law for the execution of the work. To have a law specifying in detail the methods that should be employed in prosecuting the surveys, that had been drawn by a special commission of experts and approved by the administration, relieved the superintendent of much of the responsibility that had been borne by Professor Hassler, although it did not put an end to the carpings of the critics, or their advocacy of the less expensive, quote, nautical surveys. The reorganization provided for the employment of civilians and officers of the Army and Navy to serve directly under instructions from the superintendent, thus securing for the service the opportunity to procure the best talent from either civil or military life. The civil element, it was assumed, would form a body of experts for the prosecution of those branches of the work not properly falling in the direct line of the military, and experience has demonstrated that while the results anticipated have been fully realized, the organization has not only proved effective but conducive to the advancement of the survey in many ways. The Civil War was a serious interruption, but alone proved the wisdom of the civil organization of the Bureau. On the outbreak of hostilities, the military element was necessarily withdrawn for duty with the Army and Navy, and it was not until 10 years after the close of the war that officers of the Navy were again available, while officers of the Army, through the exigencies of the military service, have not returned at all. The organization was preserved through these 15 years by the permanent civil nucleus, and the work suffered no deterioration, but steadily advanced, notwithstanding that the larger number of the civilians were constantly employed during the 4 years of the war with the armies and navy, in different capacities on the staffs of commanding officers, and that the urgent necessities of the government devolved additional labor and temporarily a new class of work upon the office force in compiling, draughting, and publishing maps of the interior for the use of the armies in the field. And when finally our armies were disbanded and our fleets reduced to a peace basis, and officers of the Navy resumed the execution of the hydrographic work, it was but to step into the duties of their predecessors. They had, too, the additional advantage of the 15 years' experience of the purely civil administration of the survey, during which time the trained surveyors of the land had become equally expert as surveyors of the water, and had added not a little to the improvement of hydrographic methods. The history of the survey shows a steady advance in methods of work from its foundation to the present day. But so equally has the march of improvement been due to the zeal and untiring efforts of the civilians and officers of the Army and Navy alike, that any distinction would be invidious. The plan of reorganization of 1843 provided for a detailed survey of precision. It was to be based on an exact triangulation that would ensure positive results, that the location of a danger or the development of a new channel should be beyond doubt, and that the survey, when completed, should fit together as one continuous line, in which the distance and direction of any object on the map from any other object should be true, whether the objects were in hailing distance of one another or at the extremes of our boundaries. So well was the scheme conceived, so perfect has it proved in operation, that it is substantially the guide for the closing labors of the great work, notwithstanding the many improvements that experience has wrought in the details. Those engaged upon the survey have been quick to profit by experience, and the master mind of Professor Bosch, the second superintendent, was not slow to adopt that which promised increased economy, rapidity, or improvement. He drew from all sources. Science contributed her quota, and the great inventive genius of the American people played an equal share in producing the final results. The researches that were necessary to obtain the information required by law, quote, for completing an accurate chart of every part of the coasts, end quote, have produced results of great economic and scientific value to the whole people, aside from their bearing on the interests of commerce and navigation, and which will contribute to the welfare of mankind long years after those who labored for them have passed away. A brief reference to a few of the many instances that might be cited to illustrate this perpetual influence to benefit our fellow men may not be without interest to some of you present. The application of the method of determining latitude by the measurement of small zenith distances, introduced by Captain Andrew Talcott of the Engineer Corps, USA, while serving as an assistant on the survey, developed such radical errors in the star places given in the catalogues that it led to an almost immediate call for better places, and arrangements were made with the observatories of the country to obtain the necessary observations, the survey to pay for the labor involved. Stimulated by the knowledge that better work was required to meet the new demand, observatories deficient in instruments procured new ones and soon furnished more accurate star places. Continued observation has added still further improvement, until today we have catalogues that furnish the highest degree of precision. Professor Chauvenet defines Talcott's method as, quote, one of the most valuable improvements in practical astronomy of recent years, surpassing all previous known methods, not excepting that of Bessel by prime vertical transits, both in simplicity and accuracy, end quote. But the advantages of the method have been found to be of a practical nature also, as it is productive of large economy in time and labor, and has reduced the cost of the survey many thousands of dollars. The introduction of the electric telegraph was utilized by the survey immediately on the practical accomplishment of the first line built as a ready and improved means for determining longitude. Indeed, before Professor Morse had demonstrated to the world the truthfulness of his theories and experiments, the bare possibility of their success and availability in the instant transmission of time had been discussed on the Coast Survey, and the method to be first employed fully considered. But, as in the application of all things under new conditions, experience is the teacher, and improvements were frequently made, until finally the invention and perfection of the chronograph has brought the method to a degree of precision that little more can be looked for. This method of determining longitude, introduced, fostered, and perfected on the Coast Survey, has been more far-reaching than geographical boundaries. All civilized nations have adopted it as the American method, and by the greater accuracy and reliability of the results, the whole world has profited. The saving that has accrued by the more perfect determination of longitudes and the consequent increased safety to commerce may be counted by millions every year, until one stands aghast in contemplation of the immensity of the sum, and fears to reckon it, even approximately, much less to prophesy what it may reach in the future. The system is but a natural sequence of the development of the telegraph, but emphasizes, in a marked degree, the spirit of progress that has ever been the active principle and guide in the conduct of the work, and advanced its methods to a state of perfection that has called forth the admiration of the scientific world. The determination of the magnetic elements has been a subject of investigation from the early days of the survey. The knowledge sought was essential to the navigator, and in recent years especially has proved to be of the greatest practical value on shore. Limited by small appropriations, the research was at first slow, but a trust fund left by Professor Bosch, who always evinced the warmest interest in this particular investigation, added largely to the rapidity with which observations could be obtained. Until now we have magnetic maps of the United States of such reasonable precision that they are authoritative and are in almost daily demand. The results are more far-reaching than their mere tabulation for the current year, as laws have been determined by which the declination in a locality can be ascertained for any year in the past. There are but few places where the needle remains stationary or points in the same direction for any great length of time. It even changes daily and during the hours of a day. But the aggregate for a year will rarely exceed 3 or 4 minutes of arc. If we reflect, then, upon the great use made of the compass in the settlement of the continent, and the proverbial neglect of the country surveyor of those days to record the local variation or declination with his work, we may see a little of the utility and practical purposes to which the results are constantly being applied. Property so little thought of 100 years ago that a few acres more or less, lost or acquired in its transfer defined by compass surveys, may suddenly assume a value in these days of progress that every square foot is worth dollars. When a dispute arises, deeds are examined, lost or obliterated marks are diligently sought for. Perhaps one is found. Surveyors are employed to run out the lines, but only make the confusion worse. Instead of a few rods that were in doubt according to the best information, the surveyor's line makes it acres, and litigation looms up to eat the profits of the sudden rise. And there seems even then no satisfactory solution of the vexing problem. How valuable then must be the fact that it is possible to compute the variation for years back, to the time the original survey was made, and furnish the deflection that will rerun the lines so clearly as to render the descriptions in the deed intelligible. This is but a single instance of the practical application of the knowledge gained, and if its general usefulness may be judged by the numerous inquiries made of the Bureau, it is not unreasonable to assume that time will bear increasing testimony of its great economic value from those who traverse the land as well as those who sail on the waters. The study of the recurrence of the tides along our extensive coastlines, and determination of laws that would satisfy the great variance in the different periods, was a problem of no little magnitude, but the greatest possible importance to our commerce. Much of the traffic along the coasts literally moves with the tides, and the cost of transportation is enhanced or diminished as the tide retards or advances it. Hundreds of dollars of expense may be incurred on a single cargo that must enter on the high water, but, through imperfect knowledge of the master of the ship, is forced after sighting his port to wait for the next tide, perhaps overnight, and is driven to sea by a sudden storm and the voyage made several days longer. Such mishaps are not infrequent, and even at the great port of New York, certain classes of vessels must wait for the tide. The investigation of this complex subject has resulted in the acquirement of a knowledge that enables the prediction of the time of high and low water, and the height of the tidal wave, years in advance, and the mariner may now carry with him the tables published on the subject wherever he goes, and be independent of the doubtful communications he may otherwise receive from the shore. How many lives, how many dollars have been saved by the knowledge gained? But the investigation of the tidal phenomena is of great scientific importance also, and a practical assistance in the great problems involved in the preservation and improvement of our harbors. But in this connection, it probably falls more properly under the head of that greater study of the currents and their effects in the erosion and building of the shores, the movement of the sands and formation of shoals and channels, termed physical hydrography. Our commerce depends largely on this study for its perpetuation, for without harbors commerce must cease, and without harbors that will admit vessels of the largest class, it must deteriorate. If commerce finds increased profits in large vessels, it demands increased facilities, and the bars to the harbors with but 6 or 8 feet of water on them a few years ago must have 10, perhaps 15 feet now, or the people must suffer their trade to pass to some more fortunate or energetic neighbor. This may be a hardship, but the demands of trade are inexorable, the profits must be reasonably assured, and those who would have the trade must comply with the requirements. Thus we see the striving for harbor improvements, the weakest making the greatest outcry that they shall not be left in the race. And the improvements must come in the end, or at least be attempted, for it is as much a law of commerce not to be hampered by small freights, as it is the law of nature that water flows downhill. End of section 7.